folks. Welcome to the last part of our series on trauma. Now, yes, this is burn taphonomy. Technically, burning is a part of taphonomic changes. That is, changes that happen after death. But we're treating this like trauma because it does have a traumatic effect on the bone. So we're going to talk about how it affects bone, how burning and situations in which high heat are applied will affect bone, and what we can learn from the way that it affects the bone. So let's get started. First of all, burn degrees. Now I'm positive you've heard of first, second, and third degree. First degree burning is the outer layer of the skin gets reddened, and this is your typical sunburn. Second degree is the inner layers of the epidermis start to get burned as well. This causes that blistering, which can also be associated with sunburn, really severe sunburn. Third degree is something that is literally the highest degree that happens during life, and that is the skin itself is becoming charred, meaning it loses all the moisture in it and starts to actually burn. So then you get that charring. It's almost like a charcoal effect of the skin. Now, fourth and fifth degree burns happen after death. This is things that you don't learn about normally, unless, of course, you're dealing with it as a taphonomic change to the body. Fourth degree is when the muscle tissue begins to char. By then, the individual would be well dead anyway, even if they were just being burned alive, like, I don't know, Joan of Arc, for example. The muscle is burning all the way down to the bone. At this point, there's different effects that happen to the flesh on the body and the body itself. The biggest one is known as the pugilistic posture. We're going to talk about the pugilistic posture or boxer's posture in a minute. It's kind of an old-timey term, but it really is indicative of what's going on in a way. And then finally, we have fifth degree burn. At this point, all the soft tissue is burned away. And now we're starting to see the bone itself has gone beyond charring into kind of a charcoal, or even beyond that, where it's sintering. It's becoming like a white, chalky ash substance. So these are some of the things that burns can do well beyond first, second, and third degree. This is the pugilistic pose. There's going to be some gross stuff in this episode. You bet there is. Just so you know, pretty much from here on out, we're going to be looking at pretty gross stuff. I mean, there's some drawings and stuff like that, but most of the rest of it are going to be photographs of burned bodies. This is clearly directly after the burn. In fact, there's still fire going on in this image. But this pose, where we call it pugilistic, just so you know, pugilistic means a boxer. It's an old Latin term for boxer. And the idea is the arm bends, so you get a flexure of the elbow, and the wrist also flexes. It's kind of more like what we may describe modern times as a bunny rabbit pose, where you kind of bend your arms and flex your hands forward. So you're kind of in this bunny rabbit pose, but it's technically called the pugilistic pose because bunny rabbit doesn't sound as cool, I guess. We'll see the same sort of thing happen to the legs as well. So the legs will also flex, meaning they bend at the knee. And we're going to see some of the other effects of this, but the pugilistic pose tells us, okay, this burning has gotten to the muscles. What it's starting to do is dry out or desiccate the muscles in such a way, and the muscles do only one thing. If they lose all their moisture, they shrink. Muscles can only contract anyway in life, but in this sense, the shrinking of the muscles causes this pugilistic pose, and generally, the stronger muscles will override the weaker muscles, so you get that bending happening, the flexing of the joints. Here is a broad example. This was, I think, in Rwanda, where an entire church was burned. You're going to see a few things going on here, but first and foremost, you'll notice the pugilistic pose and bent knees on almost all of these corpses. Not all of them. You'll notice some are doing a slightly different one that looks almost like a bear hug pose. And this has to do with how the bodies were burned. Oftentimes, if the hottest part of the fire was to their back, they will start to open up and get that sort of bear hug pose. And you can see that in the body closest to us here, down here at the bottom. He's got this open-armed bear hug pose. Hers is slightly different, but similar. This one the same. We've got these open-arm bear hugs. This is a classic pugilistic posture, okay? Other things that you may notice that's happening is the skin will often start to split because of the charring and reveal underneath what's going on underneath. Usually it's the fatty layer underneath that is the most revealed. For example, you have these longitudinal splits down the leg here. Here's some cross splits going on. This is a fusion of the fatty tissue out of the body. It's starting to boil is what had happened. Again, we've got the pugilistic pose in this state. Again, depending on not only the severity, but also the angle or direction of the burn, we can get that kind of open-armed bear hug kind of a pose. This is because most of the fire was mostly affecting this individual's backside. You can tell if Hollywood is involved. This is a classic. This is from The Walking Dead. I think back when they were still watchable. The fake Hollywood style generally will just have a laid out body. I can tell you from an insider's perspective, these are really well done, except for the pose. And the main reason for that is the way the bodies were made. It was just easier to do in this way. Also, it generally tends to bloat out the bodies a little bit, and that's not being done here. And that's from that the fatty tissue starting to expand and boil. Skin splitting and skull bursting. Sounds crazy, right? The skin splitting is classic example, like I said, where the skin is shrinking because it's burning, it's charring on the outside, so it shrinks. And when it shrinks, it can't cover enough area, so it starts to split and break apart. So that's what we get. We get these splits all over in various different areas, and it has nothing to do with anything except for the severity of the fire in a given area. And by the way, as it mentions in that note below, don't mistake this for some sort of sharp force trauma. It's not. If contained in the bone, if soft tissue with a lot of liquid is contained in a bone, for example, bone marrow and of course the brain, then what will happen is they will start to boil. And that boiling will cause the liquid to become a gas, and that means expansion. If the fire is hot enough for the expansion to be rapid, then the bone may burst, including the skull may burst apart. Again, not to be mistaken for blunt force trauma or a gunshot or anything like that. As we mentioned when we were talking about the JFK and the GSW talk, brains explode out quite often from a lot of things because there's so much moisture, and it acts as a hydraulic force that has to displace somewhere when we have a massive expansion in the sense of the fire or movement of those liquids. They have to go somewhere. Okay, charred bone tells us an awful lot. I'll give you a little precursor here. You'll notice the charring of this skull. You'll see there's a definite pattern. You see how darkly charred it is here? And how down here it's not charred at all. What does that tell us? Very important what that tells us. That tells us that the flesh was on it when the bone began to burn. Just like all the other trauma patterns that we saw. We will have a postmortem, perimortem, and an antemortem or premortem rotate or designation here. So what we're looking at is if the skull was burned well after all the flesh was already rotted away, this skull would have a uniform burning to it. However, we know that the flesh was still on this skull when it was burned. That tells us an awful lot. Now, this can be mimicked in certain taphonomic situations, and I'll tell you about those later on. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward how this works. What we're looking at is a progression across the top, and then it continues across the bottom. So we're going to look at how the top image will show you how the flesh is being, how it's reacting to the flame. Okay, so here we have a flame. It's a directional flame. It's only on one side of the face, and it's going to hit the ear, hit these edges of the face. Now, the first thing that are going to start to break through and go away, where the bone will be exposed first, will be where the flesh is thinnest toward the fire. So up here on the scalp, relatively thin. Right here on the cheekbone, relatively thin. Right along the base of the jawbone, relatively thin. Now, this can be different according to how big or small the flame is, where the flame is, where it's directed, etc., etc. So the first thing that we're going to see is the outer flesh starts to char and burn and blister, right? It is having no effect on the skull beneath. Here, now we have these blisters getting larger and larger. The nose and upper lip and the eyelids and the ear are all starting to shrink. What's happening is the cartilage in the ear, the nose, are starting to shrink because they're losing water. The skin would be starting to char at this point. So you get this upturned nose look, and the eyelids would probably start to go away a little bit. Now, we're still not having an effect on the skull. Now, we move on. Now, this charred skin is starting to split and starting to open and show areas underneath in the thin areas, like along the cheekbone, along the base of the jaw. Now, the muscles are starting to become affected. You can see the ear is virtually gone. Eyelids would also probably be gone. The nose is pulled up in a much more dramatic fashion, which in turn brings the upper lip up. But something else is starting to happen. The muscles are starting to lose force and lose control of things. So what you're going to start seeing is the jaw is opening. The tongue from the heat is starting to swell. Remember, your tongue is a muscle. So it's going to swell first. It's got a lot of water in there. So it's going to swell up, opening the jaw and starting to protrude. The nose is virtually pulled all the way up and in. Again, no effect yet on the skull. Now we have this part of the skull is starting to open up. Now we're going to start seeing the skull through here. All the fatty and muscle tissue has become charred and is pulling away, making this split bigger and bigger. These splits are starting to open. This part right here with the very thin area over the bone because of its proximity to the fire is going to start opening up as well. The cheekbone should be opening up, so there should be a little dark mark here along the cheekbone, but there isn't. So we have the black mark here, the black mark here, and honestly there'd be a little bit of black on this part of the bone too, on the cheekbone. We're continuing now, okay? We're still with the same thing going on. What we're starting to see, again, starting from this side and going this direction, what we're starting to see is the skull now is nearly completely exposed. The top of the skull is exposed. The ear is gone. Now we've got all this muscle starting to be exposed. Again, the cheekbone would be exposed by now. The nose is virtually gone. The jaw is completely exposed. Things like that. So with the exception of here on the cheekbone, it should be exposed. There is some muscle going up to and around the cheekbone, but there's actually no muscle right here on this edge that comes back. So that would be exposed, much like this picture, not so much this one. Okay, so what's happening to the bone? Well, now we're starting to see the charring affect the teeth. The jaw is getting larger. There would be a burn mark right here. And we see now that skull is completely charred and starting to calcine up here. But you'll notice along here, look at that, nothing. Where the deeper flesh is, there's nothing affecting the bone. Now we're starting to expose more and more of the face. But the flesh is gone. Now all we have is the muscle. Muscles are much thicker than the skin, and the fatty tissue has started to burn away. So now the bottom of the jaw is completely exposed. Again, this cheekbone would be totally exposed. Up around the eye orbit, the top of the nose, all of this is all exposed. So what's happening, we're seeing charring on all of these things, not inside the orbit of the eye, because remember that eyeball is still there. There's a lot of muscle surrounding the eyeball, and it's a very wet organ. So what we see is those tend to either steam out, but they start to shrink up almost last in the face, again, depending on where the fire is in proximity to this head. So now we're starting to see even larger areas starting to turn into what we call calcine, which means it's very chalky, very flaky, almost ash-like. Then we have the charred bone, and then we still have the completely unaffected bone in the thicker areas where there's more muscle. Moving on, now the artist has finally exposed the cheekbone. Cheekbone would be exposed here if this is anatomically incorrect. So we would see charring along the cheekbone here. We're starting to see the top of the mandibular condyle starting to burn all along here. Now we're seeing the calcification, the calcine, happening along the edge of this jaw. The teeth are exposed, the nose is exposed, and the head, the calcined area of the head is much more affected. And then finally, we're here. We've got very little chunks of muscle tissue still involved. Most of the skull is exposed, so we're going to see this very telltale pattern. So things that we're learning from these are we can clearly see both where the fire was involved, and we expect to see the thinner areas of tissue to expose first and therefore burn the bone first. This is very telling because in certain areas we will see the flesh burn away and the exposure happening quicker and quicker and quicker, depending on the thickness of the tissue itself. So again, we're having the exposure to fire on the bottom side of the hand, of the arm, which is extended here. So now you see it's starting to curl, starting to get into this pugilistic position. It's going to affect the fingers and knuckles and hand and wrist faster than the rest of the arm because the rest of the arm is thicker. It's got more flesh on it. Okay, again, no exposure to the bone. Now the tips of the knuckles and bits and pieces of the carpals, which are up here in the wrist, are starting to be exposed. Realistically, if we had these burn underneath here, the elbow would start to be exposed by this point as well, just the tip of the elbow, where the artist has not done that. So we'd have a little burn here, burns on this part of, depending on where the fire is, the carpals and the knuckles are starting to expose. Carpals, knuckles start to expose more and more and more as the flesh burns away. The flesh is now splitting like we saw in all the other stuff. Pugilistic pose is pretty much complete. Now we have the exposure of the elbow, and we'll see this charring here. The artist has a little bit of charring here on this is called the deltoid tuberosity. Truth be told, we'll see that less at this point than we would on more of this part, and probably the ulna, the entirety of the ulna, which is this bone here. The hand is completely burned, and smaller pieces like the fingertips and fingers are starting to fall away. So here they are, piling up below. Here we have a little bit, just the little smaller bones that have all of the connective tissue is burned away, so they start to fall away. Now the entire hand is fallen away, and we have a lot of exposed bone. Most of the larger muscles are starting to shrink and char. So now all of this would be charred. These bits would be well calcined by this point. So we can tell a lot by where the fire was according to how the bone burns. And we can tell how the bone burned by this color progression, right? Um, Finally, the last thing that happens after the calcine stage is the bone itself will start to fracture, have these interesting little fractures, these splits and breaks that start to happen, similar to the way that the skin is splitting. So the stages of bone charring are pretty obvious. They go from brown to black to gray to white. Color equals the temperature and the duration of the fire. So you can have a super hot flame, and it'll turn it white almost immediately. I'd say the typical examples of this would be like the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Second World War. What we're looking at is people who were basically brought to ash immediately in a split second. That is an immensely hot flame. A typical flame would do this slower progression. Okay? Here's some real bone so you can look at it. We're looking at unaltered bone, which is the kind of pale whitish chart. Now, obviously, this is kind of a yellowy picture, so you're losing a little bit of the browning, but let me point it out for you here. So this part right here, this is what we're looking at with the browning. Okay, it's turning brown, then black, then gray, then given enough time, this gray eventually fades into this white, and we start to see this cracking. Now, interestingly, why is this crack black? Truth is, the crack is black because this is ash from the burning of the marrow on the inside, which starts to escape, start to go and steam out. And it can actually cool along this crack, or it can leave sediment. So it's like ash from a chimney fire. Okay, so even though the bone underneath it may be calcined, it's starting to get this blackish look to it because of the marrow or the soft tissue that's burning from within starting to fade away. Okay, this is a typical skull that we were talking about. You'll notice where the flesh is relatively thin, we have it burn away first. And we have our blackening. We don't really have any browning. We have this lighter color, but the browning would be right around the edges of this, except for this was a pretty high fire. This was truthfully done on purpose using a torch. But what we're looking at here is calcined bone, charred bone, and unaltered bone. So what we can tell is this was a fast fire, a very, very high heat fire, and I bet you can tell which direction the fire hit from. Now, I mentioned that the presence of flesh can be mimicked. There's only one real way that it happens normally, unless somebody did this on purpose, and that is if it's partially buried. If this skull was, let's say, along here, covered with dirt, if this part was underground and this part was all exposed, and a flash fire like a forest fire went over this, very hot, very fast duration fire, you could have exactly this look, where all of this was covered up by mud and dirt and all kinds of stuff, whereas the exposed areas were the only part that was exposed to the burning. The other thing that we can tell, well, I can tell, is since this does not have that edge of brown, this bone was dry before this fire was applied. This is sort of a prop. This is also a dead giveaway. But this fire was a prop made to teach with. So that just tells you a little insight. Is if this was natural, this area through here would all be like kind of a darker brown. Darker than this natural brown tone. Okay? Now, we understand that cracking is going to occur at certain places, and we understand why it would. For example, if you have a heat border, which is what we were just talking about, this means there was flesh on here. Now we're going to start having cracking because what's happening is between the heat border, along the heat border, you have this part which is completely exposed to the fire, this part which is still under flesh. So you're going to have two of what used to be the same thing trying to do two different things. This bone is trying drastically to shrink. This bone is trying to bend and accommodate. So in between, you're going to have cracks open up. Okay? So charred bone and cracking and the visual representation. Now you can see here longitudinal cracks going the long way. And on some other bone, we're going to see some cracks going the short way, like kind of across here. There will be like a series of cracks. These are very similar in what causes them, and it really has more to do with the structure and the differences of the fire, which we're not going to get too far into. Here's some of those longitudinal, I'm sorry, these cross cracks. They often have kind of a scallop to them. They're sort of curvy. Some of them are straighter, but generally they follow this curved line. But this tells us a little bit about the duration, heat, and angle of the fire. But we're not going to go too far more into that other than the bone is trying to react two different ways. One way is just trying to be bone, and the other side is trying to burn and shrink. So what's happening is the shrinkage is happening on one side, not on the other, so you're going to get these cracks. Finally, the last stage is really fragmentation. This is where the bone, even if it's perimortem, the bone is dried out so much that all little pieces will start to flake off. Furthermore, we may be having small little micro explosions of these gases, specifically steam, escaping from the bone. When that soft tissue gets so hot that it's got to go somewhere, the bone itself is weakened from the charring, so it just kind of pops and goes out. If you want a similar idea of this, if you've ever seen pine cones, or even if you put wood into a fire, you'll see those kind of things going on. This isn't happening the same way in the bone. It's obviously not flammable sap that's exploding. Instead, it's just steam. So it would be like similar to cooking meat. You'll hear the steam hit the grill. Now, killers think that burning things is the way to go. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about that. Burning actually tells us some of the story. So let's talk about some problems killers may have if they try to cover up a crime by burning it. First of all, can a body be completely consumed by fire? The answer is no. Unless there's some form of other fuel fueling the fire, meaning it's not only got to have fuel, but also an oxygen source to burn. Why? Remember, bodies are mostly water. Water doesn't burn well. Water actually helps fires go out because it cools the flame down enough. So bodies don't burn well. We're about 80 to 90% water, depending on who you ask. And we do not burn well. You absolutely need to have some form of sustained heat, which means not only fuel, but also oxygen. Once all of the organic matter is burned, we're talking skin and cartilage and muscle and all the rest of it. The mineral component, even of bone is made of partially things like cartilage and different proteins, which are organic, which can burn. But the other part are things like calcium and phosphates and phosphates, which don't burn. So once it's burned down to only organic material, it won't burn anymore. It's literally fireproof. It's like trying to burn a rock, because that's what rocks are. Rocks are minerals too. So at that point, you literally have to crush up a body. So to reduce a body completely to ash, you literally have to crunch it up with something mechanical. Now, the problems aren't just for killers. We also have investigators. We have a lot of problems with burn things too, but maybe not what you may think. Perimortem trauma is often confused with burn trauma. For example, straight lines usually mean a cut or a slice. Most of the burn marks are curved or jagged lines. Perimortem trauma has striations and kerf marks. Burn marks do not. Fragmentation. The longer, the hotter the fire burns, the bones are reduced to smaller and smaller, more fragile fragments. The bone can shrink up to 15%. Therefore, we can't really figure out how tall or how big this individual was because they can shrink, which is crazy. So there are a lot of issues with dealing with burned bodies. The other thing, one of the ones that doesn't come out in most thoughts about this, is fire amelioration, meaning the firefighters do a lot of damage when they come into a crime scene. If they're trying to put out the fire, imagine this. You've got high pressure water hoses hitting a body. So you can bet that's going to fray and flay and rip into stuff. The flesh, which has now been weakened by this charring, will just be ripped apart by the direct impact of a fire hose. Furthermore, walking around, putting things out, collapse, buildings collapsing on top of stuff, all of that will make it more difficult to figure out exactly what happened. But not impossible, just difficult and messy. Okay, now this is kind of a fun little addition talk. It's really, I think this is sort of an expansion on my idea of pseudoscience, where I talk about fake sciences and things that TV shows love to tell you about. If you've ever had me for 101, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But this idea of spontaneous human combustion. Now, this is something that used to make the rounds all the time. In the 70s and 80s, it was a big deal. In the 90s, it started to wane. There's still a few other, like you'll still hear an occasional TV show or something like that, which will consider spontaneous human combustion. A lot of people still believe this. I'm here to tell you, it's not real.
What?
There's no such thing as spontaneous. Spontaneous means nothing caused it, right? Just caught fire. And there are some curious ways in which bodies burn. Bodies do burn strangely. And I'll show you some pictures of some very interesting cases, but I will also tell you the reason that they look like that. It's pretty easy, pretty straightforward, and everybody understands it after you know what to look for. Okay, so there's no obvious ignition source. That's actually not true. There almost always is. In things like that happened in the 1970s, 60s, 80s, they would always say, there's no obvious ignition source. And the first question I would ask them is, did they smoke? Answer's 90% yep. Or did they have a fireplace? Yep. Were they near the fireplace? Yeah. Did they have candles? Did they have a blatant ignition source? The answer is always yes. So the truth is, there's always an obvious ignition source. Arms and legs and head are often unburned. Now this confuses people because they expect for the arms and legs and head to burn first because the flesh is thinner there. Truth is, all other things being equal, they would. But there's something particular about this. There are always burns on the ceiling and under the body, but nowhere else. A charred, oily residue, usually all over the place, like this kind of greasy residue. It's like the inside of an oven. That should be a clue right there. The actual physical burn marks, though, the chars, are often only on like the rug directly beneath their body and the ceiling directly above it. Doors, windows are often closed and often locked from the inside. Now, the doors and windows being closed should tell you the other half of what the, quote, inside of an oven clue was. Hopefully you're starting to put this together, but maybe not. So let's look at some pictures. This is how bizarre they can look. Now, this picture was enhanced. SHC means spontaneous human combustion. This picture was enhanced. That skeletal outline there was put in to show where the individual would have been. It's not really there. You'll notice in the background, behind this guy, behind the investigator, you see all this oily, blackened residue everywhere? But look, this is a wood floor, and the only burn marks on the wood floor is right around this woman's body. Furthermore, her legs completely untouched, virtually unburnt. But this little scrap of cloth is a clue. You could probably make out from looking at the investigator, this image was taken in the 1960s. That's kind of telling. The other thing about this that's interesting, I think, is this woman had natural, meaning silk, stockings on, meaning these nylons are not nylon, they're silk. There are holes in them, but natural silk. That's important. This is another classic example. Now, this is a very old photograph. You can probably tell. This is, again, from the 1960s. And here we have a woman. These are cotton stockings. Give you an idea of the age. This is in England. But you'll notice her body is burned. It's the 1960s. That should be telling. And you see this oily residue. And by the way, a very obvious point of combustion. It's a fireplace. Okay. Hopefully I've clarified some things. I want you to look at these pictures because we're going to talk about how these happen in the next few slides, and I don't want you to forget what we were looking at. So look at these things. First of all, the rest of the rug untouched, unburned. Okay, her couch untouched, unburned. Above about 2 to 3 feet in this apartment where all the windows and doors were closed and locked, as like the previous, we have this oily residue. You also have a burn mark above the fireplace, not surprising. And if it made it far up enough, you'd have a burn mark on the ceiling, and you can see this part here has been affected by the fire. This is the fireplace guard. It normally would be in front of the fireplace, clearly is not. That is also telling. This is where her head would be. Okay? Hopefully I've walked you through some of this. Another case where his leg is exposed, unburnt. Furniture, unburnt. Fireplace, obvious point of ignition, obviously. TV has charring, and that sort of oily residue you can see is up here at about the 2 to 3 foot mark. And you can see a clear flame char above the fireplace. Also, again, notice the fireplace guard out of place, and his other leg is going along here and is burned. And notice the rug is untouched outside of the direct area of burn. Okay, what is going on here? This is what's happening, you guys. The body is essentially a candle. Now, when you include the clothing of the day, remember, 60s, 70s, what kind of material comes to mind? As in, what was clothing made out of? If you said polyester, congratulations. All these people were dressed in polyester of some form or another. This is partly why, with the kind of return to the natural fiber clothing that most people wear these days, we don't see as much of these, quote, spontaneous human combustion things. So, the first thing that happens is the elderly, they're almost all elderly, person collapses in their apartment. They're alone, it's cold outside, they've got the fireplace going, and they go to get up and do something, and boom, she falls forward. You'll remember the fireplace protecting screen was knocked out of place. This was probably done by the woman as she fell forward, head right into the fireplace. Hair goes up, whoosh. Guess what catches next? That polyester. But here's what happens. The polyester is both a fuel and a source of oxygen. It burns very well. So the polyester is burning. Now remember, this building is all closed off. The apartment, the flat, the house, whatever, all the doors and windows are closed, which was part of the mystery if you watch it on TV. Truth is, that's why there wasn't much air going in or coming out. So what do we have? Well, you've got basically the perfect ingredients to start a smoldering fire, meaning a fire that doesn't burn quickly because it starts to consume most of the oxygen. It becomes oxygen starved and it slowly burns with very small flame. Don't believe me? Put a candle under a glass and watch the candle flame. It'll eventually go out because it's burning off all of that oxygen. So then what happens to the human body is the fat that's in the main torso area of the body starts to effervesce, starts to wick out of the body as this heat keeps going and it's pulled up through the skin and into the cloth. It's now acting like a candle. So the main body of this individual, fueled by this outer shell of polyester clothing, not touching their feet, which are either bare or they're wearing leggings of natural fibers. So it just burns and burns and burns and burns very, very slowly. It's only going to affect the area right around it because remember, these are low flames that don't whoosh out of everywhere because they're not getting enough oxygen. As this continues to burn down over several hours, the body fat is the candle wax that's burning. Okay? It keeps what's left of the cloth doesn't have to burn anymore. This is exactly the way a candle works. Remember, a wick is made of a flammable material, but then when it starts to melt the wax of the candle, it starts drawing the candle wax, that's the fuel, up through the wick, and now it's just burning that fuel. It stops burning the wick. That's why the wick doesn't burn down too fast. Every time you start a candle, the wick burns a little bit. Okay, so this burns down over a long period of time until finally the fat fuel or the oxygen is completely burned out. Therefore, everything is reduced down to ash.
I'm outie. Here, tell these people something they don't know about me.